Hi, my name is Alexis Boylan, and I am thrilled to be with you today for my talk, The Obliterating Whiteness of the Ashcan Circle in U.S. Visual Culture, or an alternate title would be, or Why We Should Always Be Suspicious of the Term Realism. Before I get started, I wanted to begin by acknowledging and honoring the various tribes and people of the land on which we are gathered, again, virtually, and recognize their continued connection to the land, waters, and cultures. I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I have been invited to talk today as part of the programming for the exhibition that has opened just a couple of weeks ago at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts called American Realism, Visions of America 1900 to 1950. And I wanted to just also give a shout out before I began to Miriam Thomas, who has coordinated this conversation and who has also been very patient with me as I have sent over my talk. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm actually very sorry that I couldn't come out there and see the show. It looks amazing. And I hope that today what I will do with your talk is to give you some interesting and hopefully interesting and hopefully some new perspectives with which to go and look at the show, interrogate the show, and more broadly sort of interrogate how it is that we talk about American visual culture, how we categorize art, who is often included and excluded from those conversations. I think one of the things that's really exciting about this version of this conversation at Kalamazoo is the emphasis on expanding who we have historically, and when I say we, I mean art historians, museums, people who write about American art, have included in these conversations about American realism. I'm going to be tossing us back in some ways in focusing on the Ashcan Circle to earlier traditions and earlier canons and earlier ways of framing how it is that we talk about American art and how we talk about different periods and different styles and different artists throughout the 19th and 20th century, but actually truly well into the 21st century. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this idea of American realism, and then thinking about it as the first 50 years of the 20th century, is how often actually we keep hearing about in contemporary art a neo-realist movement or a resurgence in an interest in realism. And often that can mean something very conservative. Often it can mean something very progressive. But what we're going to see is that the tighter we try to hold on to this idea of realism, the more we see how slippery it is, how it fails to sort of stay put. It fails to really clarify any of the things we might want it to. And instead, and this is what I'm getting to in my title, what we often see is that realism is another way of simply highlighting or obliterating certain people or certain narratives from dominant, popular, and scholarly and visual culture. And so I think that one of the things I wanted to do today is, of course, to give you some, to have an opportunity to talk about the Ashcan Circle, to talk about how they do and do not contribute to this dialogue of realism, but really, I think more concretely to sort of get us to a point where we can really interrogate why we still want to use the idea of realism, how valuable this concept of realism is, and what it is that we might be able to do to make this concept of realism more productive for perhaps the social, racial, gender, sexual, corporeal realities and justices we'd like to see in the future. So I'm just giving you an example here of some of the works that you that are part of this collection, and specifically the Robert Riggs piece, "Chemical Plant," showing ostensibly an image of working class in a factory as the sort of highlight of the image, and then also an image by Robert Henry, an artist we're going to talk about in just a moment. A later image of his from the 1920s called Catherine, during a period where Henry often understood sort of, I think, a little bit sort of mythologically as the sort of leader of the Ashcan Circle, although I would say that there isn't really a leader, and we'll talk about that in just a few moments. But these two images, again, sort of speaking to this dialogue of realism and a way in which American artists in the first part of the 20th century use realism to perhaps push the boundaries and expand what it was that American visual culture was contributing, both internally within the United States and externally, meaning on the world stage, and particularly in the context of European art. I wanted to read you the exhibition description because in some ways I want to play with the ideas, and I think one of the main sort of interesting pieces of the exhibition that, and I'm going to move my screen of my little box a little bit. So I'm going to play with a little bit of what is mentioned and what is not mentioned in the exhibition, the description of the exhibition. In the closing of the 19th century, and I need to move over my screen sharing, and in the first decades of the 20th century saw massive changes in the American art scene as artists heavily influenced by Western European centers, began to aggressively seek to define, quote, a new American art. Fueled by trade, industry, and immigration, New York grew into a dominant international city, easily rivaling its European counterparts as a hub of finance and culture. Artists responded to this transformative period with explorations of the changing social scene and growing urban landscape, resulting in a revolutionary time for American art. American realism, Visions of America, 1900 to 1950, looks at the period through the paintings, drawings, and prints that sought to capture the new American experience, especially within the nation's burgeoning and rapidly expanding or rapidly evolving urban centers. Drawing primarily from the collections of 3 Michigan museums, the show begins in the early 1900s and continues through the 1940s, highlighting artists whose work sought to define the era. The exhibition often explores the contributions of women and artists of color active during this period to share a deeper look into the stories and lives of those who did not always receive widespread attention during that era. American realism will feature the works of artists such as Robert Henry, George Bellows, Jacob Lawrence, Guy Penet Dubois, Edward Hopper, Peggy Bacon, Reginald Marsh, Huey Lee Smith, and many others, including Michigan artists who sought to define and document the changing ways of living that they saw around them. I wanted to highlight this for you because I think one of the really interesting things about this exhibition description is that, in fact, the word realism is only used once, and that is in the title. And I think that it's an interesting sort of slippage here, because I think that actually often when art historians and curators write about work or think about this time period, we tend to actually stay away from the word realism. We understand that it has a stylistic function. We understand that it has a certain register, mainly in that it is not abstraction, right? And we're going to talk about the sort of how that grows from a different conversation about how we actually define American art later on. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that while we might want to talk about American realism as something that exists as opposed to modernism or as opposed to abstraction, and that we often then try to talk about the sort of revolutionary aspects of realism. I think one of the ways in which we often, while emphasizing this idea of realism, is then trying to de-emphasize realism as actually being realistic or necessarily documenting something that is real. And instead, we often then try to sort of hedge a little bit, talking about how we, at the end, sought to define and document the changing ways of living. And part of this is, again, I think a question that we have to sort of ask, which is, what does realism mean, and how effective is the term realism in what was truly sort of a new century in which photography was coming into its own as an art form, where cinema was also coming into its own as an art form, both of which could also claim the authorities of realism. So I think that right off the bat, we need to be a little suspicious about what is both drawing us into that term with realism, and why even the curators of this exhibition seem a little hesitant to really commit to this idea of realism as a philosophical or artistic, easily defined commodity. That what instead we're sort of being pointed to is that it is looking at changes, it is looking at new definitions, it is looking at expanded topics. And as we're going to see when we talk about the Ashcan Circle in just a moment, this is absolutely true. Artists of the 20th century did look to expand what was considered American, who was considered American, who would be considered as part of dialogues about nationalism, what bodies counted, what bodies mattered, what bodies could be seen. But one of the things we always have to keep track of is, just like a camera we can't see outside of the border, painters and artists and sculptors make hundreds of thousands of choices. And in those choices are decisions about what we are to see and what we are not to see. And so I think that as we talk about sort of what constitutes realism for the Ashcan Circle, it's going to become increasingly apparent that as important as what they visualize becomes a story of what they refuse to visualize. And specifically what I'm going to be talking about today is a real refusal to paint the diversity of New York City, and specifically the hundreds of thousands of African Americans that were living on the Eastern Seaboard, and specifically in New York City, and that were very much a part of the neighborhoods and stories that Ashcan artists wanted to tell about New York City. And so again, we have to sort of question, what is it that we are seeing? What is it then we are being told is real? And who is being prohibited from participating in this story of realism? I'm going to get a little bit more specific about one of the things that I want to focus on in this talk. The Ashcan Circle, perhaps more than any other collection of US modernist artists, is almost synonymous with the notion of realism. Urban, gendered, classed, labored, ethnic, and yes, even racial realism specifically. Yet what can it mean that in these dialogues of the most, and I'm putting in quotes here, real visual production, has been quiet to the serious engagement with Blackness? This talk looks to consider the implications of realism as it has been weaponized in Ashcan art and US visual culture in order to silence and disperse Blackness with an obliterating obsession with whiteness. In other words, one of the things that I want to sort of talk about is the way in which even our art historical narratives and the ways in which we define moments through style or through artists and groups of artists, we privilege certain ideas. And realism seems to be an idea that throughout American history, in American visual culture rather, really is about blockading out Black bodies from the story of modernity and from the story of dominant and canonical US visual culture. At the end of the talk, I'm going to sort of discuss some of the ways in which this show really does sort of push against those narratives. But I want to leave you with a lot of questions that you can go see this exhibition with about what is real and how productive is this idea of realism as an art or visual concept. When we talk about the Ashcan Circle, we are specifically talking about 6 artists: Robert Henry, Everett Shinn, George Lukes, John Sloan, William Glackens, and George Bellows. Often these 6 men are referred to as the Ashcan School. I don't like this term, partially because it gives a kind of hierarchical standing. And as I had mentioned, that often someone like Henry is understood as the leader or the head of this Ashcan group. And I also think that the idea of a school a little bit suggests teachers and students. It suggests a kind of educational process. And what we're actually seeing here is a collection of friends, a group of men who, many of whom started off together in Philadelphia as young men who went to art school together, who worked in various newspapers as illustrators together. And then around 1900, one by one, started to move to New York City. And again, I mean, this is a very sort of indicative move of the ways in which the art scene was changing in the country. And whereas Philadelphia had and continued to have and continues to have a vibrant art scene, that really there became an understanding that it was New York City that was the place in which the major conversations about art and artistic production in the United States were happening. So one by one, these group of friends sort of collected in New York. And between the sort of decades of, the first decade actually of the 20th century, exhibited their work several times together, gave talks together. They were in studios, they sent letters, they went on vacations, their wives were friends. They really were all very much intertwined with each other's lives and artwork in a way that I think, considering them as an Ashcan circle, does more justice to the sort of intimacy, friendship, and camaraderie that these 6 men had, as opposed to sort of something more established or considering sort of something more hierarchical like a school. Again, I think the other thing that we see is that all 6 of these men were, to greater or lesser extents, interested in depicting the city around them. They were committed to producing contemporary art. They were committed to looking at what they thought was the broadness of possibilities and potential in New York City, and looking for new subject matter. And again, all of them were very much, many of them, most of them actually, either started off or continued in various moments of their lives to continue to produce illustrations, to work in various moments as illustrators. Several of them worked in art schools. All of them needed to make money. And so in this other sense, they were also a new kind of artist, in that they were very consciously and very, how do I want to phrase this? They were on the make. They were looking to hustle, and they wanted to create press about themselves and their work. They wanted to be understood as a group of artists who had something new to say, and very much tried to market themselves as such. When we look at their images, or the images that they are most known for, what we see are, first of all, big images. And when I mean big, I mean epic. They didn't want to paint anything small or delicate. They were interested in big color, big tonality. They were interested in also what was happening in the city. So when we look at this painting by George Bellows, what we see is a vibrant New York, a New York that has a multitude of people where it almost seems difficult for our eye to pick out individuals, and instead they all collapse and coalesce together into this sort of vibrant, energetic, clogged traffic, commerce-filled street. And that's what we see. We see people working, we see people selling, we see advertisements, we see horses, we see police officers, we see people cleaning the streets. We see in these various moments all of these stories and all of these people coming together in this new urban space. And again, if we want, and what people were sort of attracted to in calling the Ashcan Circle realists, was this idea that this was a new kind of art that was focusing on new kinds of actors, new kinds of scenes. We see it here in another, an image by George Luke's Cafe Francis. What contemporary audiences would have understood is this woman as being most likely a prostitute, a sex worker. And she is in the process of having a night out. Again, not the typical, not what we would have historically in US visual culture understood and seen. Previous to this, there was very limited male-female images of male and female intimacy or flirting, and certainly nothing as unapologetically sort of sexual about appetites and desire and commerce as what we see in Ashcan Circle works. What we also see is, and this is a quieter, although I would not say that it's a quiet image, I would actually say it's quite a sort of epic and big image by Sloan, John Sloan, McSorley's Back Room. So a bar, a very famous bar, an Irish bar in New York City, in sort of midday, or in the afternoon, really. Nothing that is particularly, again, there isn't necessarily a narrative here. This isn't like a story that coalesces or has heroes or victims or anything like that. Instead, what we're seeing is kind of a quiet and profound moment, a slice of the city. And again, this kind of imagery was very much being sold by the Ashcan artists as a slice of life. And indeed, the Ashcan artists were very committed to going out to the city and sketching. They were a part of this urban community. They were a part of this city. They were a part of the world in which they wanted to depict. And what we see is images which speak to that kind of participation. This very clearly breaks with the kind of art that was being produced a generation earlier. And I'm showing you here a sort of image of Washington Arch in the Spring by Hassam. Although, I mean, I do have to just sort of connect here that we see a street cleaner in this image, as we saw in the previous image of New York City. But what we're seeing here is a much more genteel, a much more contained scene. Even the worker and his white suit has a sort of fits in the context of these white gleaming arches and the clean streets. This is not a New York City that is out of control. It is not a New York City that is overrun with commerce. It is not a New York City that is practically tipping over into chaos. It is refined. There is still a kind of class organization expression that Hassan is very clear about articulating. There are ways in which people move through public spaces. Parks are not seen as a place necessarily where there is a lot of mixing of classes or people, but rather a kind of park or sort of playground for wealthy New Yorkers to get some air. What we also see is a real emphasis on kind of the greenery or the picturesque nature of New York City. This is not a city of New York, a picture of New York City per se, but again, the kind of art we tend to see more, this sort of pseudo-impressionistic, very sort of, again, highlighting an upper class, moments of leisure, and specifically also women as embodying this kind of good life, this kind of leisure class, this kind of way in which beauty and calmness and the sort of benefits and beauty of the Gilded Age were personified. Which again only highlights how very different the Ashcan Circle is. And then again, I'm sort of giving you, I'm stacking the decks a little bit to sort of make the case for sort of viewing the Ashcan Circle as realists. That when we think about an image like Doing, and then when we look at an image like Bellows, it's important to keep in mind that both are fictions, but both members of this club seems to be a narrative that is more willing to embrace the sort of largeness of a new and modern experience, as opposed to an image like Doing or Chase, which seems to still be hovering around the edges of a very much more sort of way of imagining that the United States hasn't changed, that it is essentially upper middle class, that there is very little or no struggle, that there's no class division, there's no racial division, there's no gender divisions, that everything is the same, everything is consistent, and everything is quietly beautiful. Bellows and the Ashcan Circle are clearly not invested in that narrative. That's not something that they choose to look at. What we also see is that the Ashcan Circle are very different from other ways in which, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century, masculinity is portrayed. Frederick Remington is far more sort of, probably even today, popular and familiar in his images of the West and his images of a United States which was filled with victims and victors and white bodies moving and with authority across the West, and a kind of masculinity that is about conquest, a kind of masculinity that highlights this idea of urban places as potentially threatening to urban masculinity, and that what white men needed was to get out of cities, to break away from repressive factories and capitalism, and instead find their authority, find their individuality out on the plains. Now, of course, the fact that Remington did many of his images from New York State and not from out west was to a certain extent, and to the people who were interested in those images, beside the point. That for them, this was a kind of realism. This was a kind of vocabulary that they thought was invested in the particular historical moment. And again, what you see are an enormous sort of cultural obsession with this idea that men could not establish their masculinity, white men could not establish their masculinity or their authority in urban spaces. They needed to do it in the West. Because, and again, this is another narrative that is being aggressively pushed in all kinds of mediums in the early 20th century, cities were overrun, according to all kinds of newspapers and all kinds of imagery, with immigrants. That cities were becoming unmanageable, that cities were becoming unruly, that cities were becoming unknowable locations filled with people who had come to America, but were always coded in these visual images as not Americans. And you see in this kind of an image, this real fear of what would happen if people stayed in New York, specifically if white people stayed in New York. That this idea of New York in the future was one in which Jewish people and Muslims and people from Asia and immigrants from Europe, specifically we see in here, caricatures of the Irish and others, would literally overtake the city, making it places that were simply uninhabitable for what was also then being coded as respectable white real Americans. And you see how this word real is very problematic. What you also see is that cities and the very way in which cities were being identified as locations of capitalism and industry were exactly thus the places in which the male white body was going to deteriorate. And we see here again from Life magazine another image of how the white body is deteriorated visualized as being deteriorated in New York City, in city spaces, that capitalism was literally, figuratively, emotionally, all kinds of ways deteriorating to white authority. And again, what you see is that Ashcan artists reject that narrative. And here too, there is this easy way in which you can see that art historians and curators and others looked at these images and said, this image is far more realistic than this image. That this image, which embraces this idea of docks as being places in which there was both labor being had and labor not being had, and where there was a mixing of immigrant populations, and that commerce had a particularly gritty and perhaps not necessarily, completely seductive presentation, appeared to many as a far more realistic narrative. And then again, this is how this idea of realism becomes so potent. We also see that in terms of gender dynamics, there is a great deal of hysteria at the beginning of the 20th century about the changing roles of men and women. And we see here the kind of classic Gibson girl is what she was called, white women who were going to college, who were riding bicycles, who were getting jobs outside of the house, and literally picking at and ultimately one would imagine putting on a poster like a butterfly this male specimen. So again, a lot of sort of visual hysteria and visual anxiety about the changing role of men. We don't see this as much, or we see this in a very different light. Here we have Henry's portrait of a chorus girl who is dressed up like Salome. And again, this idea, this way in which Ashcan artists seemingly were uninhibited or embarrassed or interested in the new modern woman, in portraying the ways in which working women and upper class women lived their lives. And we're seeing here a beach scene, again, sort of flirting, swimming on their days off, working, mothers, children, that we're getting more of what we would call a diversity of experiences, particularly in regard to the ways in which there was all of this visual hysteria and anxiety about changing roles for men and women in this part of the early 20th century. Similar with working. We often see images, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that often prior to the Ashcan Circle, American artists are almost allergic to this idea of men working. We're looking at an early 19th century image with William Sidney Mount, work that would be incredibly physical and incredibly sweaty and instead looks like a picnic. And then also later in the 20th century, the way that a group of photographers really sort of made the working body heroic. Also, what we see is that there was a lot of visual pressure on men to show and prove productivity, or to show and prove that through work and through their own sort of sense of self and their own individuality and individualism, how they were going to get ahead. So, I mean, again, in just this YMC advertisement, this sort of idea that there is progress that needs to be made. The Ashcan Circle are very much more, how shall I say this, ambivalent about this idea of work and progress, and instead spend a lot of time focusing on, for example, and this is a very difficult image to see, and I apologize for that, but this is actually an image of unemployed men in a line for coffee, getting a handout on the streets of New York in the evening. Again, homelessness, unemployment, all sort of ideas and images and bodies that had been historically in US art pushed to the sides. Again, making us sort of see like, oh yes, the Ashcan Circle, they really are realists. Again, I love this image because what we see is actually bodies at work, and then we also see equally a lot of bodies not working. This idea of sort of what it means to work and what it means to labor. What we also see is that there are these vast, almost overpowering work sites, that we are no longer getting this idea of man conquering the urban landscape, but instead Ashcan artists often show men and women often being subsumed by the urban landscape, not sort of coming out as dominant, but instead being almost enveloped, and almost oftentimes their bodies disappeared within it. And here again, often we can't see the line between working and not working in Ashcan images. Likewise, Ashcan artists often portrayed themselves in radically different ways than the previous generation of artists did. Previous generation of artists often positioned themselves, when they did portraits or self-portraits, as businessmen, as industry leaders, as a kind of established, wealthy gentleman. What we see in the Ashcan Circle are, even when they do self-portraits, they tend to sort of almost disappear themselves, making themselves not people who could be bankers if you didn't know what their job was. And I think in these two portraits, what you can see is that, yeah, there's the artist, you know, there's some paintings behind, but if you don't exactly know who these people are, it's not distinctly clear that they're artists and not just simply very wealthy businessmen of the Gilded Age. Henry and others, when they do self-portrait, and others at the Ashcan School, again, seem to emphasize the unevenness of his skin tone, his ear. He literally fades into the background, again, disappearing almost his own body, his own sort of importance. What we also see is the Ashcan Circle was willing to allow themselves to be commodified by particularly interestingly some very radical female photographers, allowing their bodies to be sort of used like models, again pushing this idea that they were willing to think differently about what it meant to be an artist, what it meant to be a man, to have a, and again, as we sort of often art historically like to argue, a more revolutionary, a more real relationship to the sort of early modernism in the United States. And again, I just sort of wanted to sort of end this sort of little conversation about this with, I love this image, and I'm always sort of drawn to it. Clearly a working class woman, probably on her way home from her work day or some other chore. It's a rainy night, and looking at windows at outfits that she probably can't afford. And there's a real sort of interesting sense of sort of the loneliness and isolation, and also the sort of problematics of capitalism itself and the way in which it is constantly making us want things that we can't have, and looking at ourselves and not seeing exactly the body and the life that we want to live. And again, it's an image like this that makes so many people want to talk about the way in which the Ashcan School was important, because they brought realism to the story. And just showing you this another image like this. In many ways, though, the sort of story that art historians tell about the importance of the Ashcan Circle comes to a crashing end with the Armory Show of 1913. Now, of course, it doesn't. And as you will see in the exhibition, there's a number of pieces done. The Ashcan Circle continues to make paintings for decades, some of them. After the first decade of the 20th century, they continue to evolve as artists. But what happens, and what is interesting, and what sort of makes this conversation about realism more pitched, hinges around this exhibition in 1913. And I'm just going to show you quickly two images that highlight sort of what happened at this show. We see Robert Henry, our old Ashcan friend, and his image on the right, figure in motion, very realistic, a nude, but not a nude that we would have seen, again, a sort of a nude in the realist style. But then we see on the left Marcel Duchamp, and a very, very different kind of nude. A nude which is very much engaged with the stories of modernism and the stories of abstraction that are coming from Europe and that are hitting in the United States. And this is a sentence from wall text from the 100th anniversary show. They, the Ashcan Circle, worried that the radical new European movements might overshadow the work of American artists. Two factions represented competing visions of modern art and its future in America. The Ashcan School's idea that what modern came from the late 19th century were ideas about subject matter. The new works from Europe brought with them a new sense that the modern was about the art itself. They questioned traditional standards and values through experiments with form and color. In other words, what began to matter, according to a large group of artists in Europe and then in the United States, was not the subject, but the subject was becoming increasingly irrelevant. But what mattered was how you depicted it. So while Ashcan artists continue to go on, although we're seeing here two examples, you can see that they've sort of changed a bit stylistically from their earlier works, but that there still seems to be a way in which their early works and their later works connect. That in fact, where American art was headed was in, and I'm showing you here an example of Georgia O'Keeffe and Charles Demuth, works that were very much more influenced by Duchamp, by Picasso, by Matisse, by European artists. More to the point, the question became one of abstraction. And we see here, and I'm showing you much, much later works, one by Grace Hartigan and one by Sam Gilliam, about that are really focused on this idea that the story of art as a story of realistic portrayal, or a desire to be modern through depicting the now, was a very old-fashioned idea, and that abstraction was the way in which playing with color and form and flatness was the way in which you showed that you were in conversation with the modern. And I'm giving you here just a sort of a little silly graphic about, so basically the Duchamp leads to, and I'm showing you here a picture of Jackson Pollock doing one of his famous drip paintings, which leads to Andy Warhol, that this becomes the narrative of what is important about American art, that abstraction enters the story with Europeanists like Duchamp, and then it hits America, and then it becomes part of an American individualism and uniqueness and ingenuity. Now, I should say that this is a little more complicated for African American artists, who often get left out of this dominant narrative of the winning of modern and abstract art, and instead become a little bit mired in this sort of argument and conversation that emerges in the 20th century, that to be a real Black artist in the United States means to paint political art that is focused on realism. That's another lecture for another day. But what we see is that a group of art historians, in an attempt to sort of reinvigorate the conversations about realism, begin to attach this idea of realism as a kind of hyper-masculine, as a kind of hyper authentic, as a kind of way in which that that a group of artists were not overcome with a kind of what was then, and we see here in this title from the New York Book Review, ash cans instead of powder puffs. Powder puffs, of course, being a homophobic suggestion of a kind of European effete culture, of a way in which American artists got lost in a conversation about modernity, that instead we needed to look back to a longer tradition of American artists who were real American artists, who struggled to paint a real American city, who were interested in real Americans. And again, when you see images like this, it falls very much into this narrative of this wasn't always about showing the United States as necessarily heroic, but instead realism as showing the United States for who we are. So again, I'm sort of setting you up here to go to the exhibition and come to it with some questions. This all seems great then. Realism seems amazing. And realism is a different story. Realism is a story that isn't the story of abstraction, and we can have both, right? And so what's the problem with realism? What's the problem with imagining that art, American art in the 20th century, took two directions? One that was interested in bodies, in depicting real Americans and a real United States, and another that was interested in abstraction. And that's just two different directions. And mostly, what is the problem with this in regard to race? One of the things that I want to highlight for you is this really problematic, nagging question, which is, where are Black people in the Ashcan city? We do see images of African Americans, but they are at best problematic and at worst mostly disappeared. I'm showing you here Bellows, one of his boxing images features a Black body. Of course, there was a very famous fight in this time period between a Black, Jack Johnson, and a fighter and a white fighter that was very much turned into a kind of racial battle of whiteness versus Blackness. Bellows stays away from specifically noting that that is this fight, but he is very interestingly creates an image wherein our ability to access, the viewer's ability to access or to identify with the Black body is very much inhibited by the fact that we can't see the face, and that the body itself seems to take on extra human qualities. We also see here in this sort of image, John Sloan's image, one African American woman sitting in a theater. And again, she's there, but given very little context. More familiar images like this and all the other previous images that we saw from the Ashcan Circle. I'm highlighting this because a scholar, Jessica Larson, has pointed out this is an image of the Tenderloin, a district in or a part of New York City that would have had and did have a very large population of African Americans. But what we see here is Sloan's, no doubt, very purposeful, very specific recreation of this scene as one in which all white bodies move throughout the city space. Again, there is some willingness to show a diverse immigrant population, but docks would have been like the Tenderloin district, another location where there would have been a number of African Americans. These would have been spaces that would have been populated by a growing population of African Americans. And yet what we see time and time again is literally a kind of whitewashing of New York City, a way in which New York City is populated almost exclusively by white people and white bodies. I want to highlight this because, again, and I'm pulling from a very popular sort of website that gives you a lot of sort of information about American art. And so here what we see is this idea, of move this again. Populist, expansive, and committed to documentary realism. In the early part of the 20th century, a maverick group of painters in New York City set the foundation for depicting the sheer variety and scale of life in the changing, surging metropolis. Their name, like the Impressionists, was initially a term of derision branded by prevailing critics. I'm going to sort of cut ahead a little bit. And then said, but the New York, they were not interested in the posh, haute bourgeoisie of New York, of Park Avenue, Central Park, and Washington Square, but the New York of the Lower East Side and the Bowery, newly arrived immigrants, dock workers, nightclub workers, saloon keepers, boxers, and the average worker trying to make ends meet while squeezing whatever small pleasures there was to be had out of life. Their art was populist, expansive, and committed to a documentary realism that was far-reaching and ahead of its time. And again, what I want to highlight here is this is pulled from a way in which the Ashcan Circle is described today on the internet today. And this is where high school students, where college students go to learn about what the Ashcan Circle was all about. And again, what we see here is this insistence on the realism, on the truthfulness, on the way in which what makes the Ashcan Circle important is that realism is the vocabulary of inclusion. It is the vocabulary of making seen that with what hasn't been seen before. It is the way in which we create a version of America that is more, just more. But what I want to back up and what I want you to think about as we close today is, what if we start thinking about what we don't see? Or in the act of how these artists were very consciously visually disappearing Black bodies from New York City and thus from the American landscape as a kind of visual violence. What does it mean that this is not just an omission? And again, several scholars have done an enormous amount of work talking about how very close, for example, John Sloan was to living, how many neighbors he had that were African American, how very aggressively these artists had to paint out Black bodies. And then what does it mean that we are constantly then being bombarded with this vocabulary and this historical memory of the Ashcan Circle as realists, people who painted what was really there? So again, what does it mean that this is not just an omission, but an active and deliberate choice to exclude Black Americans from the visual narrative, making thus a disappearance from a political or social narrative more realistic? What is it, therefore, that I would argue is some of the damage that realism does, not just to our historical memory, although I would argue that that is very significant. But how does it make it so that it becomes more reasonable, or perhaps even more, it's not something that we are asked to question when Black bodies are edited out of other kinds of images of urban living, contemporary images of urban living? Again, what does it mean when we attach this word realism to a group of artists who seemed very much focused on including certain kinds of bodies and excluding others? How do we confront this kind of history? Meaning, what do we do with the term realism? And what do we do with the Ashcan Circle? How do we, as people who want to see a fullness of human experience, deal with this term realism? What I would say is that one of the things we can all do is go to the exhibit, American Realism, and confront for ourselves what it is that we see, but then equally ask ourselves what is being denied, what is being hidden, what is not in view. And in fact, this needs to become the ways in which we confront visual culture in all kinds of places, asking us what we see and asking us what is hidden, and always questioning this idea of the real or realism. Again, thank you so much for joining me for this talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a wonderful time going to see the exhibition. Thanks so much.